I should have known something was wrong when I walked into my apartment and the air smelled like her perfume. Not mine, the vanilla and jasmine I'd worn for years, but Sophie's signature scent, that overpowering rose and bergamot concoction she swore was timeless. I remember freezing in the doorway, my keys still dangling from my fingers, as my brain tried to process the scene in front of me. Daniel, my Daniel, with his hands tangled in her hair, her legs draped over his lap on my couch, the one I'd saved for months to buy because he'd insisted we needed quality furniture for our future home. The worst part, they didn't even jump apart like guilty people. No, Sophie just blinked at me, slow and dazed, like a cat caught in a sunbeam, while Daniel had the audacity to sigh, actually sigh, like I was the one interrupting something sacred. "Mira," he said in that infuriatingly calm voice he used when he was explaining why he had forgotten our anniversary again, "this isn't what it looks like." I laughed. I couldn't help it. The absurdity of it all, the cliché of it, the sheer predictability hit me like a punchline to a joke I'd been missing for years. Of course it was Sophie, of course it was on my couch, of course Daniel would try to gaslight me while his lips were still shiny with her lip gloss. Sophie finally scrambled upright, adjusting her top, the boho chic one she'd borrowed from me last month and forgot to return, her voice dripping with faux concern. "Mira, sweetie, we never meant for this to happen." "Bullshit," I said, still grinning like a maniac. "You absolutely meant for this to happen. You've been angling for it since the engagement party, when you accidentally spilled wine on my dress and spent 20 minutes helping Daniel clean it up in the bathroom." The memory clicked into place like the last piece of a puzzle I'd been too stupid to see. All those times she'd dropped by unannounced when Daniel was home alone. The way she'd always find an excuse to touch his arm, his shoulder, his wedding band. Daniel had the nerve to look annoyed. "Don't make this ugly, Mira. We didn't plan this. It just happened." That's when I realised I wasn't even angry. I was free. All the nights I'd spent biting my tongue when he cancelled plans, all the times I'd shrunk myself to fit into his life, all the energy I'd wasted begging for scraps of his attention. It was over. Just like that. I tossed my keys onto the counter. "Keep the couch," I said. "It's probably got her DNA all over it anyway." Then I walked into the bedroom, yanked my suitcase from the closet, and started throwing in anything that felt like me. Not the version of me Daniel had moulded, not the friend Sophie had pretended to care about, but the girl I'd been before I let them dull my edges. Sophie hovered in the doorway, wringing her hands. "Where are you going?" I zipped the bag shut and looked at her. Really looked at her. For the first time in years. "Somewhere you'll never follow." And just like that, I left. No screaming, no begging, no dramatic slamming of doors. Just silence. The kind that comes when you finally stop lying to yourself. The kind that sounds like the beginning of everything. News travels fast in a small city, especially when it's juicy. By the next morning, my phone was a graveyard of well-meaning condolences and thinly veiled curiosity. The first message came from Rachel, a co-worker who'd always side-eyed Sophie at office parties. "OMG, I heard. Are you okay?" Followed immediately by, "I always thought there was something off about her." I didn't respond. What was I supposed to say? "Thanks, but I'm actually throwing a party to celebrate my newfound freedom." Then came my mother's call. Her voice cracked on the first syllable of my name, like she was the one who'd been betrayed. "Oh, sweetheart," she began, and I could already see her clutching her pearls, mentally drafting the Facebook post she'd never have the nerve to make. "How could he do this to you?" As if Daniel hadn't spent the last 2 years showing us exactly who he was. Neglectful, selfish, chronically unimpressed by anything that didn't serve him. But now, suddenly, it was a tragedy. Now, suddenly, people cared. The coffee shop near my apartment became a minefield. The barista, a guy who'd never once remembered my order in 3 years of patronage, gave me a free muffin with my latte. On the house, he murmured, like I was a widow in mourning. At the office, conversation stuttered to a halt when I entered rooms. My boss offered me an uncharacteristically flexible deadline on a project, her eyes soft with the kind of sympathy usually reserved for terminal diagnoses. Sophie's friends, our friends once, started unfollowing me on Instagram as if I were the one who'd committed the crime. Meanwhile, Sophie herself posted a sunset photo with the caption, "When life closes a door," no mention of whose relationship she'd bulldozed to open hers. The comments were a parade of heart emojis and "you deserve happiness" from people who'd RSVP'd yes to my wedding just weeks before. The worst part? The way everyone assumed I was broken. My neighbour, an elderly woman who'd never so much as waved at me, stopped me in the hallway to press a homemade casserole into my hands. "You're too thin," she fretted, as if heartbreak was a disease that could be cured by cream of mushroom soup. Even my dry cleaner tisked and gave me a discount, his eyes full of mournful understanding. But here's the thing they all missed. I wasn't grieving. I was awake. For the first time in years, I wasn't twisting myself into knots to fit someone else's idea of love. I wasn't biting back my opinions to keep the peace or pretending I didn't notice the way Daniel's eyes glazed over when I talked about my dreams. The pity was suffocating, but it was also clarifying. Every whispered poor mirror was a reminder. I'd spent years playing a role in someone else's story. Now, for the first time, the script was mine to burn. So I did. The ring came off easier than I expected. After 3 years of wearing it, I thought there'd be some phantom weight left behind, some pale indentation, as a reminder of what almost was. But my finger looked exactly the same, just skin, unmarked and unremarkable. I rolled the diamond between my fingers, watching how it caught the afternoon light through my apartment window. It was supposed to represent forever, but all I saw was a very expensive rock that had been weighing me down. The pawnshop owner didn't ask questions when I slid it across the glass counter. She just raised one expertly penciled eyebrow and named a price that would have made Daniel furious. He'd always bragged about getting the family discount from his uncle's jewellery store. I took the cash without bargaining, the bills crisp in my palm for the first time in years. Daniel had always handled the finances, always insisted he was better at that sort of thing. Now, the money felt like possibility itself. My apartment became an archaeological dig of our relationship. His gym socks still balled up under the bed, the fancy espresso machine he'd demanded but never learned to use. Half-empty cologne bottles lined up like trophies on the bathroom counter. I filled trash bags with the artefacts of us, each item tossed in with growing fervour. The wedding magazines went first, their pages still sticky with Sophie's fingerprints from when she'd helped me dog-ear ideas. Then came the emails, unsubscribing from venue newsletters, cancelling cake tastings, informing the florist there would be no spring wedding after all. Each cancellation felt like taking a deep breath after years of shallow ones. The final email was to the band we'd booked, a cheesy cover group Daniel had insisted on because his college roommate was the drummer. Due to unforeseen circumstances, I typed, then deleted it and wrote simply, "I'm calling it off, keep the deposit." My suitcase emerged from the back of the closet, still dusty from our abandoned honeymoon plans. I packed light, just the clothes that felt like me, the books Daniel had rolled his eyes at, my grandmother's watch that he'd called vintage, in that tone that meant outdated. The rest could stay. Let the next tenant deal with the ghost of us. When the Uber arrived, I took one last look around at the apartment we'd picked out together. Daniel had talked the landlord into lowering the rent by promising we'd be long-term tenants. We'd lasted 11 months. The walls still had the faint outlines of where our framed photos had hung, the nail holes like tiny bullet wounds. I didn't take a single picture with me. The driver asked if I was going on vacation. Something like that, I said, watching the city skyline shrink in the rearview mirror. The plane ticket in my purse was one way, the destination somewhere I'd never mentioned to Daniel, because he'd always said Europe was overrated. As we merged onto the highway, I rolled down the window and let the wind whip through my hair, the sensation unfamiliar and electric. For the first time in years, there was no one to tell me to close it because the AC was on. No one to remind me to be practical. No one to insist they knew better. Just open road and the terrifying, exhilarating unknown. The weight that lifted wasn't just the ring I'd sold. It was every expectation, every compromise, every silent agreement to make myself smaller that I'd ever swallowed. I didn't know what came next, but for the first time in forever, that didn't scare me. It thrilled me. The wheels touched down at Lisbon airport just as the first streaks of dawn painted the sky in watercolour hues. I hadn't slept on the red-eye flight, my body thrumming with that peculiar mix of exhaustion and adrenaline that comes when you've burned all your bridges behind you. The airport sign swam before my sleep-deprived eyes, Portuguese words curling like smoke around familiar Latin roots. I fumbled with my passport at customs, the stamp hitting the page with finality. An official mark of my escape. Outside, the morning air smelled of salt and freshly baked bread, so different from the sterile air conditioning of my old life. My Uber driver, a wiry man with a gold tooth who spoke rapid-fire Portuguese even after seeing my blank expression, careened through narrow streets with the casual confidence of someone who'd done this for decades. Tile-covered buildings flashed by in blues and yellows, their facades cracked with character. We nearly sideswiped a tram, its cheerful ding following us down the cobblestone hill. The hostel appeared like a mirage, a peeling pink building wedged between a pastelaria and a shop selling sardine tins as souvenirs. Rosa, the owner, lounged in the doorway smoking a cigarette, her curly hair piled into a messy bun. She took one look at my oversized suitcase and snorted. Americana? When I nodded, she switched to flawless English. You packed like you're running away forever. She stubbed out her cigarette. Good for you. My dorm room held 4 bunk beds, one already occupied by a snoring German backpacker. The sheets smelled faintly of bleach and sunshine. I collapsed onto the thin mattress, my body finally giving in to the weight of the last 48 hours. When I woke hours later, disoriented by the unfamiliar shadows slanting across the floor, for one terrifying moment I couldn't remember where I was. Then the sounds filtered in. Seagulls arguing outside, the clatter of dishes from the hostel kitchen, laughter in a language I didn't understand. My chest expanded with something dangerously close to hope. That first evening, I got lost on purpose. The Alfama district unfolded like a labyrinth, whitewashed buildings with laundry strung between balconies, steep staircases leading to hidden miradores where the whole city spilled toward the Tagus River. An old woman hanging shirts on her balcony called down to me, Menina, and gestured toward an unmarked door. Inside, a tiny restaurant hummed with locals eating grilled sardines off newspaper. I pointed at what the man next to me was having and received a plate of crispy fish, skin glistening with olive oil and coarse salt. No one spoke English. No one knew my story. No one pitied me. Back at the hostel, Rosa handed me a glass of vinho verde without asking. Tomorrow, she said, we go to the flea market. You need better shoes. She eyed my pristine white sneakers, the last vestige of my carefully curated suburban wardrobe. And maybe a new life. The German backpacker, Lena, as I'd learn, raised her glass in agreement. The hostel's courtyard lights strung overhead flickered like fireflies, and for the first time since walking in on Daniel and Sophie, I felt something unclench in my chest. This wasn't running away. This was arriving. It started as a joke, really. 3 weeks into my Lisbon exile, nursing a cheap glass of house wine at a sidewalk cafe, I opened a free blogging platform on my phone. The cursor blinked mockingly on the blank page until I typed the first sentence that came to mind. If you ever need motivation to change your entire life, try walking in on your fiancé banging your best friend. My thumbs flew across the screen, pouring out every raw detail, the rose-bergamot stench of betrayal, the surreal comedy of Daniel's pathetic excuses, the way selling my engagement ring had felt more liberating than the proposal ever did. I hit publish without thinking, then immediately panicked and closed the app. Lena found me the next morning staring at my phone in disbelief. "What's wrong? Did your ex die?" she asked hopefully, reaching for my coffee. I turned the screen toward her, showing 10,000 overnight views and hundreds of comments. Strangers had shared their own stories of heartbreak and reinvention. A publisher's assistant had DM'd asking if I'd considered a memoir. A travel company wanted to sponsor my next post. My inbox overflowed with messages from women saying they'd stayed too long in relationships that made them feel invisible, and my words had given them the courage to leave. Rosa, ever the pragmatist, shoved her laptop in front of me. "You need photos. People won't care about your sad story unless it's pretty." She dragged me to a pastel dinner stand, positioned me against a tiled wall, and snapped a picture of me biting into the flaky pastry, powdered sugar dusting my lips like the first snow of freedom. "Caption it something about sweetness after bitterness," she commanded. The post went viral in Portugal, then Brazil, then with expat women everywhere who'd ever rebuilt themselves abroad. By month 2, brands were sliding into my DMs, luggage companies, skincare lines, even a Portuguese wine exporter. I turned down anything that felt disingenuous, but said yes to a local jewellery designer who crafted pieces from broken ceramics. "Your story is like our azulejos," she explained as I tried on a necklace made from tile shards. "Beautiful, because it's been shattered and remade." The blog evolved without my planning it. What began as catharsis became a guide: where to find the best espresso in Lisbon, how to navigate a foreign pharmacy when you've got a stomach bug, the Portuguese phrase for "no, I don't need help" when men got too persistent. My readers weren't just following my journey, they were using it as a roadmap for their own escapes. When I posted about getting lost in Sintra's misty forests, 3 women messaged that they'd booked flights within the hour. Daniel found the blog first, of course. His late-night DM popped up as I was drafting a post about learning to enjoy dining alone. "You're really airing our private life for clicks?" I replied with a screenshot of Sophie's latest Instagram story, her wearing the necklace Daniel had bought me for our anniversary, and wrote back, "No, that would be your girlfriend." Then I blocked him and turned the exchange into a post about reclaiming your narrative, which became my most shared entry yet. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same girl who'd muted her own opinions to keep peace in a relationship was now getting paid to speak her mind. The woman who'd once agonized over every Instagram caption now wrote blisteringly honest essays that made strangers cry in airport terminals. My broken heart had become my biggest asset, but not in the way everyone back home assumed. This wasn't about revenge. It was about revelation. That sometimes the worst moments of your life crack you open to reveal someone stronger inside. When the book deal offer came, I celebrated by buying myself a ridiculously expensive bottle of Portuguese wine. As I uncorked it on my tiny balcony overlooking the Tagus, I realised I hadn't thought about Daniel's whereabouts or Sophie's fake sympathy posts in weeks. Somewhere along the way, between the blog posts and the cobblestone streets, and the readers who said me too, I'd stopped being the woman who was left and become someone entirely new. The internet called me an influencer, but really, I was just finally listening to my own voice. And to my surprise, it had something to say. Karma came for Daniel and Sophie like a Portuguese tram, slow, inevitable, and with a satisfying screech of metal on metal. I discovered this through Lena, who had taken it upon herself to monitor their social media like a hawk with a Wi-Fi connection. "You have to see this," she cackled one morning, shoving her phone across our cafe table. Sophie's Instagram feed, once a carefully curated highlight reel of stolen happiness, had devolved into a masterclass in passive-aggressive desperation. The first cracks appeared in their couple's retreat to the Berkshires. Sophie's geotagged post showed her sipping wine alone at a resort bar, the caption reading, "When you realise some people don't appreciate what they have." Daniel was conspicuously absent from every photo. Meanwhile, his LinkedIn profile suddenly listed him as open to new opportunities, corporate speak for got fired. I traced this development back to a drunken tweet he'd liked about incompetent bosses, posted by someone at his former company. The internet never forgets. Their downward spiral became my unexpected entertainment during writing breaks. Sophie's attempt at launching a relationship coaching Instagram live backfired spectacularly when commenters recognised her from my blog. The recording showed her makeup melting under studio lights as she stammered through questions about rebuilding trust. Daniel's misguided attempt to win sympathy, a Medium article about the perils of modern dating, got ratioed into oblivion when readers connected the dots. Then came the 3 a.m. DM. "I miss our conversations," Daniel had written, the notification blinking on my phone as I drafted a piece about Lisbon's hidden bookshops. The message carried the distinct whiff of whiskey and regret. I stared at it, waiting for the familiar pang of hurt to surface, but all I felt was amusement. The man who'd once sighed dramatically when I talked about my dreams now wanted my attention. I replied with a screenshot of my blog's monthly traffic stats and wrote, "Don't worry, I'm having much better conversations now." Lena insisted we commemorate the moment with Bafanas and beer at our favourite Tasca. As we clinked glasses, my phone buzzed with a new notification. Sophie had unfollowed Daniel. By dessert, she'd changed her Instagram handle and removed all photos of them together. The relationship that had detonated my life couldn't even survive 6 months in the wild. The real punchline came weeks later when a mutual friend sent me screenshots of Sophie's new Tinder profile. Her bio read, "Creative soul-seeking meaningful connections. No players, please." The universe, it seemed, had a wicked sense of humour. Back in Lisbon, spring painted the city in new colours. My balcony herb garden thrived, my Portuguese progressed beyond restaurant menus, and my blog sponsorship inquiries now included serious literary agencies. Somewhere across the ocean, 2 people who treated love like a competition were learning the hard way that victory rings hollow when you've cheated to get there. As I signed a contract for my first book, a memoir about self-discovery through travel, I realised their greatest gift hadn't been setting me free. It was showing me exactly what I'd escaped. The ghosts of my past weren't haunting me anymore. They were too busy haunting each other. And I had a city to explore, words to write, and a life that was finally, unquestionably, mine. The emails started arriving like love letters from the universe. First a trickle, then a flood. A travel magazine wanted me to document Lisbon's secret beaches. A women's empowerment platform requested a column about rebuilding after betrayal. My inbox became a carnival of opportunities, each subject line more unbelievable than the last. The blog I'd begun as emotional triage had somehow morphed into a career, and I dove in headfirst, drunk on the novelty of people actually valuing my words. Mornings now began with pitch meetings over Zoom, my laptop balanced on the wrought-iron balcony table where I'd once cried over Daniel's betrayal. The Portuguese sun warmed my shoulders as editors in New York and London praised my authentic voice, the same voice Daniel had constantly shushed during dinner parties. My Instagram DMs brimmed with collaboration requests, but I curated partnerships with the precision of a museum archivist. No detox teas or fast fashion. Just Portuguese ceramic workshops, ethical leather goods from local artisans, and a brilliant feminist bookstore in Porto that commissioned me to lead writing retreats. The work consumed me in ways my old corporate job never had. I'd lose hours crafting the perfect sentence about stumbling upon a hidden miradoro at golden hour, or how the scent of sardines on charcoal reminded me of childhood summers I'd forgotten. My writing shed its initial bitterness, evolving into something richer, part travelogue, part healing manifesto. Readers responded to the shift, their messages more vulnerable in return. Women sent photos of their own solo tickets to somewhere brave, their divorce papers, their first attempts at writing poetry. Money, which had always been a tense subject with Daniel, became something I discussed openly with my accountant, a no-nonsense Portuguese woman named Beatrice who tutted at my receipts but applauded my negotiating skills. "You charge triple for the American brands," she advised, stamping an invoice. "They can afford it." I took her advice and watched my savings account grow fatter than it ever had during my salaried years. When the book offer arrived, a 6-figure advance for a memoir with travel elements, I celebrated by buying the emerald green vintage typewriter I'd been eyeing in the flea market for weeks. The shopkeeper wrapped it carefully in newspaper, smiling as he said, "For important stories, Sim." That night, I placed it on my desk beside a framed screenshot of my blog's first 100 views, the numbers barely visible beneath the avalanche of zeros in my new contract. The hustle changed me. My hands, once perfectly manicured for corporate meetings, now bore ink stains and a thin scar from when I dropped a tile during that ceramics collaboration. My wardrobe morphed into a capsule of linen and leather, clothes meant for cobblestones and impromptu photo shoots. Even my speech pattern shifted, peppered with Portuguese phrases and the confident pauses of someone used to being listened to. Lena joked that I'd become accidentally famous, but there was nothing accidental about the work. The pre-dawn writing sessions, the painstaking photo edits, the vulnerability of sharing my stumbles alongside my triumphs. This was my life now, built word by word on the rubble of what they'd destroyed. Sometimes, when passing the mirror in my sunlit hallway, I'd catch a glimpse of a woman I barely recognised, her shoulders relaxed, her smile unguarded, her eyes alive with purpose. The girl who'd walked in on that terrible scene months ago would never have believed this future. But that was the magic of the hustle. It didn't just pay my bills. It rebuilt me, one byline at a time. The first time I saw Eduardo, he was arguing with a seagull. I'd set up my laptop at a cafe near Cais do Sodré, attempting to write about Portuguese saudade while battling writer's block, when the commotion broke out. A lanky figure in paint-splattered jeans stood on the boardwalk, waving his arms at a defiant bird that had stolen his pastel de nata. "Give it back, you feathered thief!" he shouted in melodic Portuguese before switching to English curses when the gull took flight. The pastry crumbled into the Tagus River below, and the man turned toward my table with a theatrical sigh. "You witnessed my defeat," he said, nodding at my untouched custard tart. "Guard yours well." 3 days later, we collided again at the Feira da Ladra flea market. I was photographing a stall of antique keys when a familiar voice behind me said, "The big one opens the castle dungeon." Eduardo held up a rusted iron key with exaggerated gravitas, sunlight glinting off the silver rings on his fingers. Up close, he smelled like turpentine and espresso, his dark curls escaping from a haphazard bun. When I admitted I was hunting for props for my blog, his eyebrows shot up. "Ah, you're the runaway bride." Turns out Rosa had been telling patrons about my American girl with the cheating no-good ex. Instead of pity, Eduardo's eyes sparkled with mischief. "Excellent life upgrade," he said, plucking a tarnished spoon from a vendor's table. "Lisbon trades bad men for good stories." He paid for the spoon and pressed it into my palm. "For stirring trouble." What began as chance encounters became intentional ones. Eduardo started appearing at my favourite writing spots, always with some absurd gift. A postcard of a frowning saint, a bottle of ginger so sweet it made my teeth ache, a single sardine tin with a handwritten label that read, "Emergency rations." He never asked about Daniel or my past, but listened with rapt attention when I talked about my book chapters or blog dilemmas. Unlike the men I'd known before, he seemed genuinely fascinated by how my mind worked, not just how I looked sipping wine in golden hour light. I discovered he was an artist through Lena, who dragged me to a tiny gallery show in Alfama. Eduardo's photograph stopped me mid-step, haunting black and white shots of Lisbon's elderly residents, each portrait somehow capturing their entire life story in the wrinkles around their eyes. The series was called Memorias que não são minhas, Memories That Aren't Mine. When he spotted me in the crowd, his usual smirk faltered for a heartbeat before he recovered. "Careful," he murmured, nodding at my expression. "Your face is showing." Our first real date happened by accident. I'd mentioned wanting to photograph the sunrise from Cristo Rey across the river, and Eduardo insisted on driving me at 5 a.m. in his rickety Fiat that smelled of oil paint and oranges. We missed the sunrise because we got lost in Barreiro, but ended up at a dockside cafe eating the best bafanas I'd ever tasted. He made me laugh until espresso came out my nose, then tenderly wiped my face with his sleeve. "I like you messy," he said, and something in my chest cracked open like an egg. Eduardo became my secret test. If I described him in my blog, would it ruin the fragile magic between us? My readers noticed the change anyway. "Your Lisbon pieces have gotten warmer," commented a long-time follower. They didn't know about the nights Eduardo and I spent on his rooftop, talking until dawn about everything from Portuguese politics to whether cats have accents. They couldn't see the sketchbook he kept filled with drawings of me, not posed or perfected, but alive in motion, laughing with a strand of hair in my mouth, scowling at a broken typewriter ribbon, asleep on his sofa with ink smudged on my cheek. When I finally wrote about him, it wasn't as a love interest, but as a muse. The person who'd shown me that attraction could be about more than being chosen. It could be about being seen. The post went viral for all the wrong reasons, with commenters swooning over our meet cute. But the truth was quieter and more profound. Eduardo hadn't healed my heart. He'd simply helped me discover it had been whole all along. On the morning my book draft was due, I woke to find Eduardo gone from our tangled sheets, replaced by a Polaroid on my pillow. The photo showed me typing furiously the night before, mouth set in determined focus. Scrawled on the white border was, "Today the world meets the real you. Don't worry, she's magnificent." I tucked it into my wallet next to the pawn shop receipt for my engagement ring. 2 receipts for very different transactions. One had cost me a diamond. The other, just the courage to be myself. The email from my publisher arrived as I was packing for my first book tour, a 3-city US stint that would force me to breathe American air for the first time in 18 months. The subject line made my fingers freeze on the suitcase zipper, potential Today Show segment. Attached was an interview request from a producer who'd pitched me as the runaway bride who turned heartbreak into a bestseller. My stomach twisted. They wanted the drama, not the healing. Then came Sophie's message, out of nowhere, like a grenade rolling into my new life. "Heard about your book. Maybe we should talk before it comes out?" As if we were co-authors negotiating plot points, rather than ex-friends separated by betrayal. I didn't reply, but that night I dreamt of my childhood bedroom, its walls papered with photos of us, Sophie and me at prom, at graduation, arms slung around each other like we'd never let go. I woke with salt on my lips, Eduardo's hand warm on my back. The universe, ever the showrunner, saved its grand twist for my New York arrival. Stepping into the green room at the Today Show, I nearly collided with Daniel. He looked older, thinner in a way that suggested stress, not fitness, holding a coffee cup from the chain I'd always hated. For a suspended moment, we were just two strangers in a hallway. Then, recognition flickered across his face. Mira. My name sounded foreign in his mouth. The producer materialized between us, oblivious. Mr. Carter! Perfect timing. We'd love to get a reaction shot of you watching Miss Bennett's segment. Daniel's jaw tightened. I finally understood why I'd been booked. Later, on live television, when the host asked about forgiveness, I looked straight into camera one and said, "Some bridges aren't meant to be rebuilt. They're meant to burn so you can see your way forward." Backstage, my phone buzzed with a text from Eduardo. "You looked like a queen watching her own coronation." I left the studio without speaking to Daniel again. Outside, spring rain washed the city clean as I hailed a cab to JFK. Let them have their spectacle. My real story was waiting across the ocean, not in the ashes, but in the light. The bookstore in Chiado was packed beyond capacity, bodies spilling out onto the cobblestone street, where passers-by craned their necks to see the commotion. Rows of chairs had been abandoned minutes into my reading. Everyone stood now, pressed shoulder to shoulder in the humid Lisbon evening. The air smelled of paper and perspiration, of the white jasmine vines curling through the open windows. My Portuguese publisher had warned me the event would be big, but nothing could have prepared me for this sea of faces, each holding a copy of Freefall with its distinctive blue cover, a lone figure diving into azure waters. I'd practiced my reading a dozen times, but when I reached the passage about selling my engagement ring, the words caught in my throat. Not from sadness, from the sheer weight of the moment. The crowd held its breath with me. Then someone shouted, "Forker!" and the room erupted in applause that vibrated through my ribcage. This wasn't pity. This was recognition. Afterward, the signing line snaked around the block. Women, some tearful, some grinning, handed me dog-eared copies filled with sticky notes marking passages that had mirrored their own lives. A grandmother with knotted fingers told me in broken English she'd left her abusive husband after reading my blog. A college student showed me the Lisbon plane ticket she'd booked after finishing my chapter on conquering fear. Every story they shared became a thread in this unexpected tapestry we were weaving together. Eduardo worked the room like a silent partner, refilling my water glass and intercepting overzealous fans. At one point, I glanced up to see him deep in conversation with Rosa, who was gesturing wildly with a cigarette she absolutely wasn't supposed to be smoking indoors. Later, he'd tell me they'd been arguing about which Lisbon neighbourhood would inspire my next book. The real surprise came during the final stretch of signatures. A familiar laugh cut through the murmur of the crowd. Lena had arrived with a contingent from our hostel, all holding Portuguese editions they'd clearly already read cover to cover. But it was the figure behind them that made my pen still mid-autograph. My mother, clutching a copy to her chest like a life preserver, her eyes scanning the room as if seeing me for the first time. We didn't embrace. Not then, not with 100 strangers watching. But when I handed her the signed book, for the woman who taught me resilience, even when she didn't know she was doing it, her fingers trembled against mine. "I read it twice on the flight over," she whispered. "I never realised." The sentence hung unfinished, but the way she looked at the crowd, at Eduardo, at the city beyond the windows, told me she was beginning to understand. The party spilled into the streets long after the bookstore closed. At some point, I found myself on a balcony overlooking the Tagus, the river shimmering with reflected lights. Eduardo pressed a glass of Vinho Verde into my hand as cheers rose from the plaza below. This wasn't the ending I'd imagined when I first fled to Lisbon. It was better, not because of the accolades or the sales figures, but because every word in that book had been true. Back inside, my editor waved a freshly printed New York Times bestseller list at me. I smiled and turned back to the balcony, where the real victory waited, not in black ink on paper, but in the warm night air filling my lungs, in the unfamiliar lightness of being exactly where I was meant to be. The girl who'd arrived here with a broken heart and a half-empty suitcase had somehow become someone who belonged. As midnight approached, Rosa commandeered the microphone to propose a toast. "A autora," she began, then switched to English for my mother's benefit, "to the woman who turned her crash landing into a goddamn victory flight." The glasses clinked. Somewhere across the ocean, my past was gathering dust. And me? I was already free. The morning after the launch party, I woke before dawn and walked alone to Santa Catarina viewpoint. Lisbon stretched beneath me in the pre-dawn hush, the river a sheet of darkened glass. In my bag, I carried 2 items, a first edition of Free Fall and the pawnshop receipt I'd kept all this time like a twisted souvenir. As light bled over the horizon, I tore the receipt into tiny pieces and let the wind carry them over the railing. A final release of the proof that I'd once traded love for cash. The book I placed on the stone wall beside me, its pages fluttering like a restless bird. I'd spent months reliving my pain to write it, but now the story felt like something that had happened to someone else. A familiar scent of turpentine and espresso announced Eduardo's arrival. He didn't speak, just leaned against the railing beside me, our shoulders brushing. When I finally turned to him, his smile held no pity, only pride. "What now, escritora?" he asked, nodding at the city coming alive below us. I thought of all the versions of myself I'd been, the dutiful fiancé, the betrayed woman, the accidental blogger. The answer came easily. Now, I get to find out who I am when I'm not running from or toward anything. Back at our apartment, my mother was making tea in the kitchen, her reading glasses perched on her nose as she studied my bookshelf. She looked up when I entered, and for the first time in years, there were no unspoken questions between us. The past was finally where it belonged, behind us. I poured myself a coffee and joined her at the table, ready to begin. Lisbon's summer heat wrapped around me like a well-worn sweater as I stood on the balcony of my new apartment, watching fishing boats bob in the Tagus. The space was small, just a bedroom, a writing nook, and a kitchen barely large enough to turn around in. But every inch was mine, no compromises, no muted colour schemes to please someone else's taste, no furniture chosen for durability over character. The walls were lined with flea market finds and Eduardo's photographs. The shelves bowled under the weight of books I'd collected on my travels. My mother had stayed for 2 weeks after the book launch, her initial stiffness melting as Lisbon worked its magic. We didn't talk about Daniel or the past much. Instead, she asked about my work, my life, the city that had reshaped me. On her last morning, as we sipped coffee at a cafe near Praca do Comércio, she'd reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You're happy," she said, not as a question, but as a quiet revelation. I realised with a start that she was right. Not the performative happiness of social media, but the deep, settled kind that comes from living on your own terms. Eduardo moved in officially the day after she left, arriving with a single suitcase and a monstera plant named Fernando. "He's dramatic but resilient," Eduardo said, placing it in a sunlit corner. "Just like you." Our life together unfolded effortlessly, mornings spent writing side by side at the kitchen table, afternoons exploring hidden corners of the city we both loved, evenings debating whether to cook or surrender to the temptation of bifanas from our favourite tasca. The blog had evolved into a multimedia platform, with Lena joining as my full-time videographer. We filmed segments about Lisbon's female entrepreneurs, the art of solo travel, and the quiet revolutions that happen when women choose themselves. The comments section had become a sanctuary of shared stories, women leaving toxic jobs, coming out, rediscovering passions they'd buried for others. My inbox overflowed with gratitude, but the messages that struck me deepest were the ones that said, "You gave me permission." Daniel and Sophie had faded into distant footnotes. Occasionally, a mutual acquaintance would update me on their spirals, his failed attempts to launch a podcast, her increasingly desperate influencer pivots. But I found myself listening with detached curiosity, like hearing about characters from a book I'd read long ago. The anger had burned away, leaving only a faint imprint, like a scar that no longer aches. One rainy afternoon, while organising my desk, I stumbled upon an old notebook from my first weeks in Lisbon. The pages were filled with frantic lists. Find apartment, learn Portuguese, don't cry in public. Tucked between them was a single sentence I didn't remember writing. Someday, this will all feel like someone else's life. I ran my fingers over the words, marvelling at how right my lost self had been. That night, as Eduardo and I walked home from dinner, we passed the hostel where I'd first stayed. Rosa spotted us through the window and waved us inside, pressing glasses of ginginha into our hands. "To the American girl who stayed," she toasted, her gold bangles clinking. The hostel walls were still covered in Polaroids of former guests, including one of me on my first day, wide-eyed and clutching my suitcase like a life preserver. Eduardo laced his fingers through mine as we stepped back into the rain. The cobblestones gleamed under streetlights, leading us toward home. Somewhere out there, the Atlantic stretched endlessly, connecting this new life to the old one I'd left behind. But for the first time in years, I wasn't thinking about what I'd lost. I was too busy living what I'd found.